Hi. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome. I hope everybody is excited for today's meeting. Just waiting a little bit for all the participants in. So let's start. Hello, everyone. My name is Anna, and I'm part of the content marketing team here at Ecor, and I'm so excited to guide you through today's conversation on why most AI investments aren't showing up in business results and what is to change that. But before we jump in, I want to introduce today's speaker, Martin Drude. He's our cloud strategy and AI solution here at Ecor, and he works directly with clients on the kind of agentic AI and workflow projects that you're gonna hear today. Martin recently wrote a paper on this exact topic. So, if you ever sat through an AI pilot that never went anywhere, or you're trying to figure it out where governance fits before you scale, here's the right place. Just a couple of quick notes before we start. You will see a poll pop up during the session, so please take a moment to answer it. It helps us makes things more interactive and give us a sense or where you at this moment. By the end of the session, we'll wrap up things with a live Q&A. So feel free to submit your questions at any point during this presentation. And you will find the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window or maybe hidden under extra settings. And we'll do our best to address as many questions as possible at the end. So on the next slide, we'll start us off on a quick word on eCore for anyone who isn't familiar. We are an end-to-end global IT consulting and engineering partner, building the intelligent foundations in cloud, data engineering, and operations that deliver faster and sustainable AI adoptions, helping companies move from siloed and stall initiatives to integrated systems that actually work. You can see our numbers and a little bit of our clients. And with that said, I'll hand it over to you, Martin. Hey, Martin.
Thanks, Anna. And keep me honest when we get to the poll because I think once I get into the zone, I may just try to keep going. So please stop me so I don't barrel through it.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. And thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, taking time out of your day. Thought I'd start off with a headline. I think many people have seen these types of headlines over the past year or so. Everything from the one that's really most recent for some of us are some of the models escaping their guardrails and going out and hacking other companies. We've seen Starbucks having to pull back a 9-month effort to automate their inventory reconciliation. And Klarna made a very bold statement about a year ago. They were going to stop hiring because AI would start helping their frontline issues, and therefore they wouldn't need as much staff. They recently had to revisit that. And then, of course, one that got some major headlines in April, a software company that dealt with reservation systems, their agent deleted their entire production database and all backups in 9 seconds. So some pretty significant issues, which brings up the question, why did these companies have issues and some companies succeed? And the research shows it's not so much a matter of what you spend, it's the decisions you make along the way. And that's what we will explore today. So just from a housekeeping standpoint, won't dwell on this slide too much, just some of the topics we're going to cover: the investment reality, pre-investment framework, talk about agentic AI and some of the developments there, governance and trust, the different approaches you can take, build, buy, or partner, what kind of workflow redesigns are needed, and of course, the one that's constantly shifting, the regulatory landscape. And last but not least, the executive decision checklist, as well as time for some Q&A, and hopefully we'll get some good questions. Now, the investment reality, I have your mileage may vary, and that's because we have some very interesting statistics that came out of the research. We've got numbers here that almost seem contradictory. 95% of AI pilots failing to scale to production, yet 74% of executives report seeing measurable ROI. So what's the disconnect here? How can we have these numbers? Well, the 5% that are doing it really well are following some basic guidelines that are setting them up for success. And that 5% aren't getting stuck in that continual, never-ending pilot. They're actually seeing some real results. The thing they have in common are some points that they take into consideration before they start the project. And that's what I'd like to get into next. So that's it. It's the pre-investment decision framework. Some of these fundamental points that you want to cover before you spend any sort of money, spin up a project team. These are just some very elemental things that often get overlooked. There is such a rush. There's competitive pressure, there's boardroom pressure, there's vendor pressure. So a lot of companies are finding themselves in this solution shopping phase where they're looking for an answer before they know what the problem is. So that's what we get back to, grounding ourselves in that business problem, not thinking about the technology. Ask that question. If we didn't have AI tools, how do we solve this? If you can start there, you start building the case for this spend. And looking towards the bottom, stating the business problem in business language, not technical language, not trying to get too deep, but just state it in business terms that anyone in your organization can understand. Define what success looks like. It's really hard to tell if you should stop or keep scaling if you don't have a target. What does that end state look like? And last but definitely not least, a business owner, a champion, one that can keep you honest, one that can set deliverables, one that can fight on your behalf. These are all really important and foundational for your success. As you go into it, you're going to have to ask yourself, is AI the right tool? I mean, there is a rush to implement, but are we implementing it for the right reason? I think about it in very simplistic terms, maybe overly simplistic. And I boil it down to either deterministic or non-deterministic, or with basically ambiguity. If it's deterministic, yes, no, 0, 1, automation is the way to go. Some of the examples I have here, invoices, approvals, think of an expense report. Somebody submits an expense report. Are all the fields checked? Is there a receipt? Does it meet the spending policy guidelines? Approve it. Very easy and binary. When you get into some more complex scenarios where there might be multiple outcomes, there could be unstructured data, there could be natural language required. Think of some of the ones that we use on a daily basis, like a chat bot. And then, of course, the multi-step coordination. That's really important, where agents can do handoffs. Second point, iterate. It sounds overly simplistic to say start small, but there is a tendency for companies to try to solve everything. To me, you really need to pick very narrow criteria, going back to that business problem you're trying to solve, and define that exit criteria up front. If I want to implement an agentic tool that's going to help my customer service representatives handle 20% more cases per shift, great. I have something to measure. If I hit 15% and no matter what I do, I can't get above that, maybe it's time to off ramp, to stop, go back and revisit what we were trying to do, the complexity, or likewise, if we hit the 20% or better, we should start scaling this out because it is showing real results and it's hitting the criteria we established. And getting back to that criteria and scope, it needs to be narrow enough. If you don't have something that you can't measure within a 3 to 6 month period, you run the risk of getting bogged down in an eternal pilot. So set these hard, fast rules. And then, of course, the proof. Again, as I said, that 15% or 20% increase in productivity, those are hard proofs that you can measure against. And that's what helps you come back with facts to either get more funding or to do your postmortem on why this didn't work. All right. Now getting into agentic AI, that's where it starts getting really interesting because we're seeing a lot of the investment, especially over the past year, shift into agentic. 52% of leaders report they have agents running in production. So what are they doing with them? Google did some really good research over the past year, and I have some of the percentages there, some of the areas they're using it as, such as customer service, marketing, tech support, and security operations. Some really good areas where you can have run books and workflows that allow that agent to have this uh, area of knowledge that it can pull from, and be successful in resolving some of the challenges. The thing that really stuck out to me, though, was the investment. We're looking in the past year, or the research that was done by Grandview of about 5.25 billion. That sounds like a lot, but what really is mind-blowing is the amount it's growing year over year, that 43.84% compound annual growth rate, getting us to almost 200 billion by 2034. I mean, the investment is real and it's out there. So the question then becomes is how do you set yourself up for success? And again, following those pre-deployment points that I mentioned are what sets you up, but there is still more. An example of all of this coming together is one that we did recently for a real estate company. They're an aggregator and they will scrape over 11,000 websites and approximately 20 million listings to get all these data points to put onto their site. The thing is, when you're scraping 11,000 websites, those websites may change from day to day. So the agents, the crawlers break. It would take their engineering team up to 8 hours to fix a script. Now, that means an engineer is getting pulled from an activity that can provide some real value to a support function. So we sat there with them and went through this, went through the problem, and then helped them implement an automation using AI that would read the logs, figure out what the error is, create the fix, run it through test, and then hand it over to a human to make sure it's valid and then promote. So therefore, you go from 8 hours to 30 minutes. And some of that 30 minutes is just that human review at the end. Because one thing that we found in most of the engagements we're in and the research is a human in the loop is still needed. We're not at 100% autopilot yet. And honestly, it helps keep the process in check and it helps bring value to the people involved as well. Then we start getting into the governance, trust architecture, and security. This one has been getting a lot of attention. If you go back to the headlines that I shared, especially when it's around agents going haywire and doing everything from deleting databases to platforms that are escaping their guardrails and going out and hacking other companies. That's why it's so important to have this foundational level. Everything from your data to what the agents are allowed to do. So this is where you have to start asking yourself some of these questions because you can see from MIT's Nanda research that a third of professionals just don't trust AI. They're worried about hallucinations in their data. So you take a step back and you start thinking about where does the hallucination in this workflow create harm? So that's a blast radius question. Do you really want your agent making financial entries to your P&L a day before a quarter closing? Probably not. But if an AI agent chatbot gives out a wrong answer on a query on a product, it may be recoverable. The question you have to ask yourself is, what does the back out look like? Can we reverse this? And what is the harm of this? That's a foundational question. Also, how are we grounding the model in truth? If we don't have our house in order, in other words, our data, our run books, knowledge bases, if the agent doesn't have access to this, it may hallucinate. Grounding it in your knowledge using RAG or other methods, you can ensure that it's going to use your data, your information to answer questions or to conduct tasks. Audit. Audit everything. I know this probably sounds fundamental, but how do you know what the agent did? There might be a time, whether it's a good outcome or a not so good outcome where you want to go back and understand everything that agent did to arrive at a decision. Having that robust auditing is what enables you to do this. It helps you constantly improve, or it may bring up an issue or a scenario where you may want to tamp down that agent. Maybe it shouldn't do so much. And then, of course, the out of scope request. And when I say an out of scope request, that could be asking a customer service chatbot your horoscope, or it could be asking financial advice, something that you don't want your agent to do. And that's where guardrails come in. All of the providers have some form of guardrails, but it's not just about guardrails on input. In other words, you certainly want those guardrails on input. When someone is asking or sending into an agent something harmful or potentially trying to do a prompt injection, you absolutely want to check for that on the inbound. But equally important is the outbound, what the model produces and the agent's going to provide back to the person. If you have a medical chatbot, do you want it to share PHI information and personal health information or PII? The nice thing is all of these providers have ways where you can mask that so the agent's not going to respond in a way that could potentially either be incorrect at best or harmful at worst. So take advantage of the technologies that the vendors are providing today. This one's another interesting one that I've seen. In the rush to implement, a lot of times we have companies using their own credentials, like my credentials, to run this chatbot or this agent. I'm not sure that's a actually, I'm not sure. I am sure that is not a good idea at all. That is a very quick to market solution, but it is not a solution that is scalable, and you don't know what you're giving the agent access to. Just like I wouldn't want to share my credentials with a new employee, I don't want to share them with an agent. This kind of requires us to look at IAM and access fundamentally different. Agents need their own class. They need their own identity for a number of reasons. One, to start out with the least privilege. It takes longer. It's so much easier just to say, yes, this is root admin. It can do everything. But when you do that, you end up with things like deleted production databases and potentially worse. So I know it'll take longer and it's more cycles, but in the long run, it's much more defensible and it's a much more secure environment if you start out with the least amount of privilege and keep iterating. That's where your robust audit logs come in. You can see exactly where the agent hit a snag because of permissions, and then open up exactly the permissions it needs. Nothing more. And it will take a while, but that's what's going to give you the most secure outcome. And then, of course, your data classification. No matter what you do on the permission side, there might be data that you don't ever want the agent to have access to. This could be anything from future plans, financial statements that have been released. So classifying that data, just as you wouldn't want certain humans inside your company to have access to things, the same rules apply for agents. I know a lot of this sounds very fundamental, but the research that I've looked at and also the clients that we worked with, these are things that get skipped over that companies tend to regret later down the path. A very important one is the supply chain review. What do I mean by that? The one example I gave in the headline of the reservation company that had their production database and backups deleted, there were some supply chain components to that. And what I mean by that is, in that example, that company used three different tools. One of those tools required an API key. That API key, the permissions were so broad, the agent was able to find that API key and use that to delete the databases. That's why you really want to understand not only what you're working on, but what are the components that were brought in to support what you're deploying. It takes a lot of effort, but it is certainly worth it. Data readiness. This is one that usually makes executives kind of cringe a bit. I've heard everything from our data's a mess. We have multiple sources of truth. Our marketing truth is different than our sales truth and our operations truth. Getting those in order is also very foundational. Uh, if you have the same concept of a client or customer in your CRM system, maybe your order management system, your ERP system, which one should the agent use? So establishing that ground truth is what's going to enable you to get consistent and repeatable results. And this is something, again, that is it takes time and it takes effort, but the results for the companies that do it versus the companies that don't, it's not a gap. It's a chasm. These are really big differentiators when it comes to I showed the 95% that are stuck in pilot and the 5% that are successful. That data readiness is key. All right, you don't have to stop me. I remembered. So this is the part where we're going to talk about the different methodologies that companies have been using to implement AI and agentic solutions. So we'd love to get a pulse check from the audience on how are you doing it? So we'll give it maybe 30 seconds or so for everyone to give it a thought and then reply, and then we'll move on. And I'll take a drink. Ooh, okay, this is one of those interesting ones. Results just came in. And interestingly enough, we're about tied with partner with a vendor and all of the above. And I had a suspicion all of the above might factor in there because I don't know if there's one right approach for everyone. And I think companies at this point are taking quite a few different views or different options to see what works best. And of course, what works where maybe internal works for one, buying a solution works better for a different business problem, and partnering works for yet a third problem. So let's take a look at that. The interesting thing that stuck out in the MIT Nanda research was the difference between internal build and strategic partnership. Now, of course, I'm biased because, that's what our company does, but the results speak for themselves, and this came from MIT, not from me. 33% of internal builds were successful versus 67% for partner. And that one really makes a lot of sense to me because the partner brings in the AI knowledge experience, but you have the subject matter. You know your business better than we do. So it's that partnership where we start seeing huge value. Uh, by coming in with working with an established partner, your time to value is faster. You get high customization. Your operational burden, since you're working with a partner, it's shared. You have a lot of that troubleshooting and initial support shared between the two teams. What's really good though is that long-term adaptability. Since you're working with a partner and you get to own the end product, you end up with something that you can grow and adjust as your business needs change. And we found that that really helps with success. I didn't touch much on vendor solution, but I look at those, or those are in the research show mostly as your SaaS offerings, the ones that you're just going to buy a pre-built solution. You get in very quickly, but it doesn't give you as much room to customize it. You're kind of working with what that particular solution provides. And here's an example of a partnership we did with a fintech platform. Their accountants were spending 15 to 20, sorry, about 30 minutes going through 15 to 25 pages of these financial reports to try to find information. It was a real time sink. So we sat down with them to really understand the process. And this is where it works out really well. The accountants could help us with some of that semantic layer. What are the terms they're going to search for? What is it they need to know? And then we could then feed these reports into Bedrock, help it with the keywords, and then allow the accountants to do natural language queries so they could search these dense reports. And instead of spending minutes to hours looking for a specific item in 20 seconds, and that 20 seconds includes the time it takes you to type your question. So the response itself is rather quick. The nice thing about this, though, is again, this was allowing them to be more productive and spend more time on the strategic elements of the financial reporting, not the very tactical hunting for one small data point. Workflow redesign in the human side, this is an area that is so important yet very difficult. When we talk about change management and the way AI impacts people, it can be a difficult conversation. There's been a lot of talk over the past 12 months, specifically around AI being just a code word for layoffs. That's not what I'm seeing, and that's not what the research is showing. Yes, there's definitely been significant layoffs, but I haven't seen a lot that are tied directly to the impact of AI. Going back again to the very beginning, where I mentioned Klarna. Klarna thought that was going to have a huge impact by implementing agents to help out with their frontline support. They could stop hiring, and they did. They had a hiring freeze. They ended up having to walk that back because the capabilities just weren't there yet. Of course, you want to ensure that you account for this to make that adopt. Not only you're going to help your adoption, you're going to help your company's success. So here's what it looks like in reality. And the reason I use this example is because there was a lot of impact for this specific company. This company here is a large food delivery platform. And as they were growing, since they're growing rapidly, they were noticing that they were getting buried under alerts and noise. When they're monitoring, it took them almost 8 minutes just to respond to an alert. And if that alert required some action, over 3 hours. Uh, and of course, and they were just scaling and scaling, and this wasn't going away. This is requiring them to start pulling engineering resources into support. So now new capabilities were going on hold in order to firefight. So when we were engaged, we didn't look at it as just how can we put an agent in here or how can we automate it, but look at the entire workflow. Are you capturing the right signals? Do we need to have every signal? How do we deduplicate? Should we put in some correlation to start compressing some of these repetitive issues or repetitive alerts that are pointing to the same issue? So this was a workflow redesign as well as putting in an agent to help with this. The nice thing are the results. Going from 8 minutes to 47 seconds to respond was huge. And then going from 3 hours down to 55 minutes to resolve, well, you'd think maybe we should be able to get this down to seconds. Important point here is if the resolution is requiring a code change, we still have to go through those pathways. We still have to run it through a pipeline. We have to test it. We have to make sure we follow any change control processes. And then ultimately, if we can do an on-demand deploy, or do we have to schedule the deploy during, say, a predetermined outage window or off hours? So that's where that 55 minutes comes in. It's less about the time it took to fix. It's about the time that we actually were able to deploy. And, just getting some results like that, this client was very impressed. The nice thing is, again, this was no headcount impact. It freed up the engineers to go back to what they needed to do, work on the backlog and work on new features. And as a matter of fact, this company, after they were able to get this under control, has actually started expanding their business into other categories. And they attribute that to the cycles they got back from implementing this. Yes, the talent and change management. This is one of those areas where radical transparency is what makes success happen. What we've seen is where there's a vague or we need to adopt AI or just mandates on usage is where it fails. Either you end up with token maxing, where people are just using it to make sure that they show at the top of the leaderboard, or outright rejection because of some fear. So having that conversation and having it come from the highest levels, the C-suite, why are we doing this? How does this fit into our strategy? And how are we going to help you not only learn, but adapt to this new world? And that's where the retraining comes in, thinking about how do roles change? Maybe they look different now, but is it taking away work, or is it moving people away from repetitive tasks to higher value tasks that eventually not only help them feel more part of the company, but also help the company have better results? That's why I have it here as a first order deliverable. That human side cannot be overlooked. And in many of the cases, there are quite a few examples in the white paper which we're sharing. You'll see that it's a critical factor in success. And that's where all of you come in, this executive ownership and governance. If you look here, you can see that 62% of organizations have an established and dedicated team to drive adoption. 28% reporting the CEO responsible for governance. I want to just touch on that a bit. It doesn't mean the CEO is sitting in on every project and they're the ones saying yes and no, but is engaged, is involved, and people can tie back their projects to CEO directives. That kind of engagement is what helps not only move projects forward, but remove those roadblocks and get that support you need. Board level, it's a smaller percentage, but it's interesting because it was showing a lot in the research. I think it's great to have the board involved and update it. Whether or not they're going to have day to day, I'm not sure. But again, since it did come up as a recurring theme, I think it's good to share. So, it brings us all to that bullet point at the bottom. Without that visible senior leadership, that's where things tend to stall at the pilot stage. And sometimes you need your CEO to say, look, we haven't hit the goal. We're going to pull the plug on this. Otherwise, you end up with that, again, I mentioned earlier, that constant state of AI pilot where it becomes a time and money sink. So that's where, again, having those hard boundaries around your pilot and also having the CEO to help be the champion, whether it be success or to help sunset that project. This area here is not only one of the most important, it's probably the most rapidly evolving one, that regulatory landscape. What we're seeing is in the EU, the EU AI Act is probably the most comprehensive. In the US, we're seeing a bit of a patchwork. States are coming up with their own regulations, but it's not very consistent. The one thing that I'm seeing, though, that is extremely important, if you're following the data, the governance, security, some of the recommendations that I shared on the previous slides, this is what's going to allow you to react to these changes. Most of these changes coming up are governing on use, data classification. If you're doing that already, you're going to be ahead when these come in and not having to play catch up. Again, that's why you'll see as I shared the 5 areas for the checklist, if you're following those, it's going to set you up much better for these regulations as they continue to evolve. I really wish I had a better answer for this, but it's still early days on the regulatory side. The one thing I'm confident, though, it's going to continue to evolve and it's going to continue to impact projects. So we need to be able to answer that. The way we do it is through this preparation in the framework. Okay, now the checklist itself. I'm not going to read every single point under all of the towers here, but I'll just go over the high-level themes. This will all be provided in both the white paper and the materials we'll share with the audience. Business alignment, again, getting back to that business problem, understanding what your success criteria looks like, very important. Security and governance, looking at those new IAM roles, least privilege, data classification, organizational preparedness. Do we have job retraining? Do we have that vision on what it's going to do to our company as we move forward? Use case validation. Are we sure that AI is the right answer? Make sure it's not a good candidate for automation. Check all your failure points. Think about that testing and think about what those exit gates look like. And then lastly, that data and infrastructure readiness, which ties into security very closely. Is your data current? Is it correct? Are you pointing AI at the right source of the truth? These are all really important aspects to cover as you go through the process. So getting back to discipline, that is a differentiator. It's not about who has the biggest budget or who can deploy the most. It's really about discipline. Uh, it's knowing that you've set a clear business problem, you've defined success, and of course, you know what that point is where you stop or you scale. So that's why I have some of these areas here about defining the problems, those baselines, governing with purpose rather than caution. So in other words, no shouldn't be the answer to everything, but it doesn't mean yes is always the right answer. It requires some discretion, but you're the team that really knows what to do. You know your business better than anyone. And of course, the workforce transformation, all the pilots that moved to production had that buy-in. They had that workforce design built into them that really set them up for success. All right. Well, that brings us towards the end here. So we've got some time for questions. And of course, it's not finite. So I've got my LinkedIn there. If you want to connect with me, if you have a question that comes up after the session, and of course the QR code there for access to the white paper itself. So if we have any questions, we can, or I can try to address them.
Thank you so much, Martin, for sharing such great insights today. It was really rich, and I hope everyone found it very valuable as well. I will share with you our questions. We have a couple of those and quite interesting as well. The first one here that we have is, how do you actually measure ROI on something like an agent when the baseline was never tracked in the first place?
You cut out for a moment, but was it, how do you measure, was it measure value on when the process wasn't tracked?
Yes, let me try it again. My voice is okay now?
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, I can hear you.
How do you actually measure ROI on something like an agent when the baseline was never tracked in the first place?
Yeah, I've heard this one before, and I usually get this question when someone's already working on an agent. They have it spun up. It's working on a business process that exists today. So let's take an example of, and I'll pick a low-hanging fruit. Uh, we're going to introduce an agent to help filter out some of the repeat calls that we constantly get. So our agents, our human agents, can handle more complex ones. Well, in that scenario, a company may deploy an agent to address these issues, but then say, I don't know what the baseline is. Well, you do. You have your call volumes or your chat volumes that came in prior to the agent, and then you have the after. So you should be able to measure it. Most times, unless you've completely deprecated the process the agent has replaced, you still have an opportunity to measure the current process. And that process could be measured in time. How long does it take a person to do this? Cost. What is the cost both from labor, compute? There's ways to do this. I would need a little bit more specific, but I don't believe just because you already started down the path of deploying an agent, you can establish that baseline. I believe it's very achievable.
Good. Let's go to our second question. If partnership succeeds twice as often as an internal builds, why do so many companies still insist on building it themselves?
A lot of it has to do with the ease. Uh, it's very easy to get started, especially now with, you think of like Cursor, Copilot, Claude Code. Companies can start vibe coding immediately. You can more or less throw a business problem at an agent and it can generate a passable application. And honestly, I don't discourage that. I think vibe coding is great for a proof of concept for something you want to do internally, but obviously not for something that's going to be production hardened and ready. But because it's so easy, a lot of companies jump right in. You can see results very quickly. The difference is when you're moving from POC to production, if you don't have a partner, that's where that risk comes in. And that's why you could see that 33% success rate versus a 67. That's in both what we've encountered with our clients and the research that I did over the past several months with a lot of case studies. So it's not about so much that these companies just have great engineering teams. They do. It's just the ease of access. Companies are willing to jump right in, but unless they're following all the standard practices that I outlined, it's sometimes difficult to scale.
The third question, how do you avoid vendor lock-in if you go the partnership route?
Well, I think that one is pretty straightforward. You have to do that during the contract stage, that negotiation stage, and it's really about who owns the work product at the end. And typically, we're going to work on that in the very initial stages, and that's what I recommend that companies do. At the end of the day, are you owning that agent or the platform? Is it a SaaS platform? What is the end result and that solution look like? Who's accountable for the upkeep, maintenance, support going forward? And of course, at the very end of the day, the total ownership. Because there could be a point during the process where the company becomes much more adept. The way I look at partnerships is the company is learning the AI skills that the partner brings, but they have the business subject matter expertise that's going to allow them to extend that. So doing that, identifying what you expect to own in the very early part of the engagement before a contract is signed is what's going to allow you to avoid vendor lock-in.
Thank you, Martin. And we have a last question. Doesn't build governance now because regulation is coming, just describe compliance theater until an actual law force action.
I know, yeah, it definitely sounds that way. I can understand that question because it's a lot of work and it doesn't necessarily reflect in value now. But if one of the regulations that comes out says you must classify all your data and prove whether or not it falls under these categories of, say, PII, PCI for anything in payments, PHI for anything medical, or in the US, HIPAA. If you haven't done that already and you already have a solution out there, you may actually have to take that solution offline until you can do it. So, yeah, I can understand the comment about theater, but these fundamental objectives are what's going to set you up for success. I can't claim to have covered everything, but these are the ones that come up time and time again. And I honestly believe they have to be foundational. Otherwise, you're going to play catch up at the least, or maybe set yourself up for some legal action if you don't, or fines. So I think it's worth the effort, even though it doesn't always seem to have immediate payback.
Good thoughts, Martin. Really good thoughts today. So I guess that's it. We had four questions. Thank you so much for those who submit the questions. They were really helpful. And I guess that's it. Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you so much for everybody who watched. Such great sites today. I hope everyone enjoyed as well. And as Martin said, here on the screen is the link for the white paper. You can see it. Martin goes really deeper on this topic. And also, if you want to keep the conversation going, you have also the QR code for his LinkedIn. Thank you all, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye,
Thank
Martin.
you, Anna. Thank you, everyone.